The fire had taken everything by the time the sun rose over the Kansas plains on that bitter October morning in 1873, and Theodora Kendrick stood in the ash and ruin of what had been her home, her livelihood, and the last piece of her husband's memory, holding nothing but the hem of her scorched nightgown, and the stunned silence of a woman who has just watched her entire world collapse into cinders. She was 28 years old, and she had already buried one husband, survived a drought that cracked the earth like old pottery, and raised two small children on the edge of the frontier settlement of Caldwell, Kansas, a rough-edged town perched on the border of the Indian Territory where cattle drives came through like storms and left behind dust and coin and sometimes trouble. She had survived all of it with her chin up and her hands steady. But standing in the ruins of the Kendrick homestead, watching the smoke curl up into the pale morning sky while the embers still breathed faint orange life into the gray ash, Theodora felt the steadiness inside her tremble for the first time in years. Her son, Samuel, was 7 years old and stood beside her with a sooty face, gripping her hand with both of his. Her daughter, Clara, was 5 and sat on the scorched fence post with her bare feet dangling, watching the smoke with wide brown eyes that asked questions she did not yet have words for. The chickens had scattered. The milk cow, Bess, had broken through the east fence and was standing in the field 40 yards away, watching them all with bovine patience, as if waiting to see what would happen next. The fire had started in the night. Theodora believed it was the lantern she had left burning on the table when she had fallen asleep in the chair nursing Clara through a fever. She had woken to the smell of smoke and the roar of it in the rafters, and there had been barely time to get the children out. Nothing else had been saved. Not the winter stores, not the money she had sewn into the hem of the curtain near the window, not the photograph of her late husband, James Kendrick, who had died 2 years prior from a fever that swept through the settlement the summer of 1871, not her grandmother's quilt, which she had carried from Tennessee when she and James had come west with the promise of free land, and new starts ringing in their ears like a Sunday hymn. By mid-morning, every soul in the settlement of Caldwell had come to stand at the edge of what had been the Kendrick property. Theodora knew them all. There was Reverend Platt, whose voice was louder than his convictions, and his wife Mabel, who wore her sympathy like a Sunday hat. There was Gerald Hobbs from the dry goods store, and Loretta Finch from the rooming house, and the 2 Marsh brothers who farmed the property to the north, and Dr. Avery with his little black bag that could do nothing at all for ash and ruin. There was Agnes Dodd, who had brought a pot of something hot, and young Billy Crane, who had ridden out from the sheriff's office to look official and say very little of use. They came to her one by one and in clusters. They held her hands and pressed them. They shook their heads and made the sounds people make when they are witnessing suffering and grateful it is not their own. They said things like, "What a terrible tragedy," and "God provides," and "We are so sorry for your loss, Theodora," as though the fire had been a death and she was to be consoled rather than helped. Several of the women cried, which Theodora found mildly irritating since they had not lost anything at all. Reverend Platt led a short prayer over the ruins that referenced job and trial and the strengthening of the spirit, and several people said Amen with the deep satisfaction of those who believe they have done something useful. Theodora thanked each of them in the flat, careful way she had learned to thank people who meant well but helped nothing. She held Samuel against her hip and kept her hand on Clara's shoulder, and she looked at the ruin of her home, and she felt, beneath the grief and the shock and the cold October air on her bare arms, the particular hard-edged clarity that sometimes comes after catastrophe. She knew what needed to be done. The ash needed to be cleared. The foundation stones needed to be inspected to see if they were sound. Lumber would need to be sourced. A temporary shelter would need to be arranged. Winter was 6 weeks away, perhaps less. There was no time for grief to stretch itself out into something comfortable. Grief would have to wait. But she did not know where to begin, and there was something in the enormity of it, the scale of starting entirely from nothing, that made her feel for a moment like the ground beneath her was not entirely solid. It was then that Walter Walker appeared. He came from the direction of the livery stable at the east end of town, leading a mule with one hand and carrying two long-handled shovels across his shoulder with the other. He was 32 years old, tall in the lean, unhurried way of men who have spent years working outdoors, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days. He wore a faded canvas jacket over a worn flannel shirt, and his boots were working boots, not dress boots, scarred and practical, the boots of a man who was not here to be seen but to do something. He had a quietness about him that was not shyness, but rather the particular stillness of someone who chooses words only when they are necessary. Walter Walker had come to Caldwell 8 months ago from somewhere in Colorado, which was all anyone knew because he had not offered more and had not been asked by anyone who expected a real answer. He worked at the livery for a man named Fletcher, and he was known in the settlement as reliable, even-tempered, and almost entirely private. He did not drink at the saloon every night like some, though he was not a temperance man either. He attended church on occasional Sundays with the modest participation of someone who is being respectful rather than devout. He was not unkind to anyone, but he was not particularly warm to anyone either, at least not in the ways that people of Caldwell usually measured warmth, which involved a great deal of talking and touching and making one's feelings visible. Theodora had spoken to him perhaps a dozen times in the 8 months since his arrival, mostly about practical things. Once about whether the road north of town had been repaired after the spring flooding. Once about the price of feed corn. Once, very briefly, about whether Samuel's horse had thrown a shoe or just needed better care, which Walter had diagnosed correctly from across the paddock fence without even opening the gate. She had noted, in the idle way one notices things about people in a small settlement, that he was not a man who wasted motion or words, and that his hands, when she had seen them at work, were competent in the way that comes from genuine knowledge rather than just practice. He did not join the cluster of sympathetic townsfolk standing at the edge of her ruined property. He walked directly through the gap in the fence where the gate had burned away, stepped over a charred beam without looking at it, and came directly to where she was standing. He set the 2 shovels down, handle end up, in the earth beside her. He looked at her for a moment, and there was something in his expression that was not pity and not condescension, and not that particular performance of sorrow that everyone else had offered her that morning. It was something more like recognition. Like he understood that she was still standing, and that what she needed was not to be told she was brave for standing, but to be given a way to move forward. "Where do we start?" he said. That was it. No preamble, no condolences, no reference to God's plan or the tragedy of it or how terrible this must be for her and the children. Just those 4 words, and the shovel angled toward her hand, and those steady eyes looking at her like she was capable and not like she was a woman in need of saving. Theodora stared at him for a moment. Behind her, she was aware that the cluster of sympathetic townsfolk had gone quiet, probably because they had noticed that someone had asked a practical question in the middle of their grief performance. She felt something shift in her chest, something that was not quite emotion and not quite resolution, but something close to both. She took the shovel. "The east wall's foundation," she said. "I need to know if the stones held." "Then we start there," Walter said. He picked up the second shovel and they walked together to the eastern edge of the ruin and they began. The rest of the sympathetic townsfolk watched for a little while and then most of them drifted back toward town, which was the natural effect of seeing someone actually working. It removed the need for them to decide whether to help or not. A few stayed. Agnes Dodd, who was a genuinely practical woman beneath her neighborly exterior, took Samuel and Clara to her house on the edge of the settlement, which was a kindness Theodora accepted gratefully. The Marsh brothers, to their credit, came through the fence, and began hauling charred timber to one side after watching Walter and Theodora clear ash for about 20 minutes without asking whether they were needed. They were not the sort of men who needed to be asked twice when the evidence of the work was directly in front of them. Theodora and Walter worked without much conversation for the first 2 hours. This was not uncomfortable. It had a rhythm to it, the way real work between two people often does, where the talking is mostly done with the movement of bodies and tools, and the small adjustments people make when they are sharing a space and a task. She noticed that he did not try to take the shovel from her or suggest she do the lighter end of things. He worked beside her, not ahead of her, and when she knelt to examine the foundation stones and began rapping her knuckles against the mortar to test for cracking, he crouched beside her and waited for her assessment without offering one of his own. "These 3 are solid," she said, pressing her palm against the cool stone. "This one here has cracked through. See." She traced the line with her finger. "Can be repaired," Walter said. "Need to reset the mortar, but it won't need replacing. You've done masonry work." "Some. In Colorado." He stood, looked at the stone for another moment. "Enough to know the difference between a crack you can work with and one you can't." That was more personal information than he had offered in any of their 12 previous conversations, and Theodora filed it away without comment, because she understood the value of not making a person feel that they had said more than they intended. By mid-afternoon, the shape of the task had become clearer. The foundation was largely sound, which was the best news possible. The walls would need to come down entirely and be rebuilt, which was the expected news. The floor joists on the north side had burned through to the root cellar, which was a problem because the root cellar was where she kept most of her winter stores. And while the stores themselves had not burned, the access was now compromised and would need to be shored up before anything could be retrieved safely. Theodora sat down on the cleanest piece of stone she could find and looked at the scope of what remained and thought, with the clear, cold calculation of a practical woman, that she had perhaps $300 in the Caldwell bank, which was enough to buy lumber but not enough to hire labor and buy lumber and feed 2 children through a winter in rented rooms at Loretta Finch's rooming house, which was what she would need to do while the house was being rebuilt. "You're calculating," Walter said. He had settled on his heels a few feet away, looking at the same thing she was looking at, eating a piece of dried beef that he had apparently had in his jacket pocket. He held a second piece toward her without looking at her, and she took it without thanks because it would have been a small and unnecessary ceremony between 2 people who had just spent 6 hours doing hard work together. "The money situation is not generous," she said. "No," he chewed. "You'll need to prioritize. A sound shelter before winter, everything else after. I know that. I know you know it. I'm saying it out loud because sometimes it helps to say the sequence out loud." She looked at him sideways. That was a perceptive thing to say. More perceptive than she had expected from a man who had given her nothing but practicality so far, and she revised her understanding of him slightly in the way she might revise a calculation when new information appeared. "The lumber is the biggest expense," she said. "If I can get the lumber at cost, the rest can be managed." "Fletcher knows the mill man in Wellington," Walter said, "and Fletcher owes me about 40 hours of wages that I haven't collected." He said it simply, without any performance of generosity, just as a statement of available resource, the way you might say there is water in that well. Theodora turned to look at him fully. "I can't ask you to do that." "You didn't," he said. "I offered." He stood, brushed dried beef from his jacket. "And I haven't offered you sympathy. I don't intend to start now." That almost made her smile. It was the closest thing to which she had heard from him, and it arrived so quietly that she almost missed it. She caught the ghost of something at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile but the possibility of one, and then he picked up his shovel again and went back to work, and she followed. That first day set the pattern for the days that followed. Walter arrived each morning shortly after sunrise, with whatever tools or materials were relevant to that day's task, and he worked alongside Theodora until dark. He did not ask her permission for things that were within the scope of what they had agreed needed doing. He did not tell her what to do. He was, she realized by the third day, the only man she had worked beside who treated the work as a shared enterprise rather than something he was doing for her or doing to help her, with all the weight of obligation and gratitude those prepositions carried. On the fourth day, Gerald Hobbs from the dry goods store came out to tell Theodora that several of the town's women had taken up a collection and raised $37 for her, which was a genuine kindness, and she accepted it with genuine gratitude. On the fifth day, Reverend Platt organized a work party that brought 12 men out to help clear the remaining debris, which was more useful than the Sympathy, but involved a great deal of direction-giving and debate about the best method of doing things that Theodora found exhausting. Walter managed to work steadily through all of it without engaging in any of the debates, which she watched him do with a sort of wondering admiration. On the sixth evening, when most of the clearing was done and the foundation had been fully assessed, and the plan for the rebuild had taken a solid shape in Theodora's mind, she and Walter sat on the tailgate of his wagon in the violet dusk, and she found herself, unexpectedly, telling him about James. She had not meant to. She had been talking about the floor plan, about whether the kitchen should be on the same side as before or shifted to take better advantage of the winter sun, and something in the way she said the word kitchen, or perhaps the word before, had unlocked something she had been keeping very carefully locked, and suddenly she was saying that James had built the kitchen himself, and that he had put the window on the wrong side the first time, and had to take the whole frame out and redo it. And he had been so furious with himself that he had not spoken for an entire day, and then she had found him staring at the window at sunset, and he had said, "At least the light is right in the evening," and that had become the thing she thought of when she thought of him. That, and the way he had said her name like it was a word he had made up himself. She stopped talking abruptly when she realized how much she had said. Walter did not fill the silence with reassurance. He did not say he sounded like a good man, or what a beautiful memory, or any of the other things she had learned to dread, because they reduced the thing she had said to something manageable and packaged. He sat quietly for a moment, and then he said, "The kitchen should be on the south side. You'll want that morning light for the children getting ready for school." She looked at him. "Memory of where it was," he said carefully, "doesn't have to dictate where it needs to be." It was the most directly he had ever spoken about something that was not the immediate practical work before them, and it was so exactly right that she had to look away from him at the gathering dark over the Kansas plain because her throat was doing something that she did not want him to see. "South side," she said after a moment. "Yes." She did not ask him about his own past, though she had questions. She stored them the way she stored other things she was not yet sure how to use. The lumber came from Wellington in the second week, hauled in on 2 wagons that Walter drove himself with the millman riding along to oversee the delivery. Fletcher had indeed spoken to the millman, and the cost had come in 30% below the market price, which was not charity, but rather the kind of negotiated goodwill that exists between men who do business in the same part of the world and know they will do business again. Theodora understood this and did not pretend it was anything other than what it was, but she felt the weight of it as a debt to Walter that she was not yet sure how to repay or whether he expected repayment. She asked him directly on the morning the lumber arrived. "What do I owe you for the arrangement?" she said. He was checking the lumber for warping, running his hand along each board with his back to her. He did not turn around. "Nothing," he said. "Walter." He turned then. He had learned those first 2 weeks that when she said his name in that particular tone, it meant she required him to engage with her on equal terms and not deflect. "I spoke to a man I know," he said. "That's not a debt." It resulted in a 30% reduction in my lumber cost. It resulted in the millman getting the certainty that the full order would be paid in cash, which he preferred to the credit arrangement he had been offered by the previous buyer. He turned back to the lumber. It was a transaction. Both parties benefited. "You are extremely difficult to thank," Theodora said. There was a pause, and then he said, without turning around, "I know." She was fairly sure there was a smile in it, even if she could not see it. The framing of the house went faster than Theodora had expected, because once the lumber was on site and the foundation was confirmed sound, and the floor plan was drawn, Walter Walker proved to be something close to remarkable at the actual construction of things. He had clearly built structures before, many of them, and he moved through the work with the confident precision of a man who sees the finished thing in his mind before the first board is nailed. She watched him measure twice before every cut with a focused attention that told her he did not trust luck or approximation, and she found herself respecting that in the same deep, genuine way she had respected it in James, who had been meticulous about his measurements for the same reason. The Marsh brothers came again on the weekends and helped with the heavy lifting. Billy Crane from the sheriff's office came once and was mostly in the way but meant well. Agnes Dodd continued to take Samuel and Clara during the long working days, and Theodora made a mental note to find a way to repay that kindness that Agnes Dodd would actually accept, which she suspected would take some creativity, since Agnes Dodd was nearly as difficult to thank as Walter. 3 weeks in, with the walls framing up and the shape of the house beginning to be recognizable, Samuel escaped Agnes Dodd's supervision and appeared at the construction site one afternoon with a small hammer he had borrowed from somewhere and an expression of profound determination. Theodora started to redirect him back to Agnes's, but Walter had already crouched to the boy's level and was having what appeared to be a serious conversation. She watched from across the site, unable to hear the words, and saw Samuel nod several times with great seriousness, and then walk purposefully to a pile of scrap lumber and begin what appeared to be a small, personal construction project in the corner of the site. "What did you tell him?" she asked Walter when she got close enough. "That the site needed someone to manage the scrap," Walter said, going back to measuring a beam, "and that the manager needed to keep the scrap pieces sorted by length, and that this was essential work." "Is it essential?" "It is now," he said simply. Samuel, she noticed, was sorting the scrap lumber with the same focused seriousness that Walter brought to every task, and she felt something warm move through her that had nothing to do with the October sun, which was still generous this far south in Kansas. The evenings became a thing she noticed she had started to look forward to. After the day's work was done and the tools were put away, and whatever the other helpers had gone home, there was usually a half hour or an hour when the light was dying, and the prairie stretched out in all directions in that particular last light gold that made Kansas look like a painting, and she and Walter would sit somewhere, often on the tailgate of his wagon or on the new stacked lumber, and talk. Or mostly she would talk, and he would listen, and occasionally he would say something that was so precisely observed that she would carry it with her for the rest of the evening. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn things about a country by looking at different parts of its map. He had grown up in Missouri, the second of 4 sons of a farmer who had lost the farm to debt when Walter was 16. He had gone west after that, as many young men did in those years, following the construction of the cattle trails and the railroads, and then the mining operations in Colorado, doing whatever work presented itself and doing it well enough to be kept on. He had been in Leadville during the silver boom of the early 1870s and had been a foreman on a construction crew that built one of the large stamp mills. He did not say why he had left Colorado for Kansas, and she did not ask, but she noted the slight change in his face when he reached the point in any story where Colorado began, and she filed that away too. He had never married. He said this without self-consciousness or apology, simply as a fact, the way he stated any fact. She did not read into it, because she had learned enough about him by this point to know that he was a man whose history had been shaped by movement and work rather than by settlement. And that did not make him less or broken, only someone who had been living a different kind of life from the kind she had been living. One evening in the 4th week, She made a fire in the small camp stove she had borrowed and cooked supper for both of them from the goods she had been keeping at Agnes's. And they ate together as the stars came out over the Kansas plain in their vast, unhurried way. Clara and Samuel had come out with her and eaten, and then fallen asleep in the wagon under a blanket with the comfortable unconsciousness of small children who have been fed and are warm. And it was just Theodora and Walter in the firelight with the framework of her new house rising up against the night sky behind them. "Tell me something true," she said. She was not sure where it came from. It was the kind of thing she sometimes said when she felt that the available conversation had reached a boundary, and she wanted to know what was on the other side. He looked at the fire for a while. She had learned to be patient with his pauses, which were not the pauses of a man struggling to think of something to say, but the pauses of a man making sure he was going to say exactly what he meant. "I have not stayed anywhere as long as this in 8 years," he said. "And I have not thought about leaving since the morning I came and found you standing in the ash." She did not say anything immediately. The fire snapped, and far out across the plain something called once in the dark and was quiet. She felt the words land in her the way certain truths land, not with a crash but with a settling, like a stone finding the bottom of still water. "Is that because of the work?" she said. She was testing the question, not the answer. She wanted to know whether he would be precise. He looked at her across the fire. "No," he said. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Theodora Kendrick was a woman who had been married and widowed, and had raised 2 children on the frontier, and had stood in the ash of everything she had built, and had not wept in front of anyone who could see her. And she understood exactly what had just been said, and what it cost a man like Walter Walker to say it. And she understood that it required nothing of her in this moment except to receive it honestly. "I need to tell you something," she said. She had not planned this either, but it was there, suddenly, fully formed and necessary. "I am not a woman who is looking to be taken care of. I need you to know that, because I think it matters to what I'm about to say next." "I know that," he said. "I have known it since the moment you took the shovel." She felt something unlock in her chest, something she had not known was locked. "I have been watching you," she said, "for 4 weeks, and I believe I have seen something real, not a performance, not a man trying to impress me or win something from me. And that is so unusual that I did not know what to do with it at first." "What are you doing with it now?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. "Telling you," she said, "that I notice it, and that it matters to me." They sat in the firelight for a long while after that, not talking, but the silence had changed quality. It had become something companionable and warm, and Theodora sat inside it and felt, for the first time in 2 years, something that was not grief or determination or the constant low-level anxiety of surviving, but something that might, if she was careful with it, grow into something much larger. November arrived, and with it the first serious cold, which sharpened everything and put urgency back into the pace of the construction. The roof was the critical piece, and the weekend before the first hard frost, Walter organized what amounted to an all-hands effort, recruiting not only the Marsh brothers but also 4 men from the cattle ranches north of town, and by some combination of his quiet authority and the simple fact that winter was visibly arriving, the roof went up in 3 days. Theodora worked alongside the men, passing boards and holding frames and driving nails, and if any of the ranch hands from outside, the settlement found it unusual that the woman whose house was being built was working as hard as anyone on the crew, they did not say so, partly because the evidence was right in front of them that she was capable, and partly because Walter Walker was not the sort of man who invited commentary on things he had already decided were not up for discussion. The day the roof was finished, Theodora stood inside the new walls of her new house and looked up at the solid lines of it above her and felt something she had not expected, which was that it was not James's house anymore, and it was not a copy of what had been, and it was not the result of grief or necessity only, but was something that she had made, with her own hands and her own decisions, and the help of a man who understood the difference between building someone a thing and building something with them. Walter was behind her. She turned to find him looking at the roof with the same expression he always wore when a thing had been done correctly, which was not pride exactly but a quiet, grounded satisfaction. "It's plumb," he said. "Yes," she said. "The mortar on that northeast corner will need a touch-up in spring. I see it. The kitchen south side window is exactly right." She looked at it. The late November light came through it at exactly the angle she had wanted, washing the new board floor in gold. "Yes," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady, but she did not try to make it steady. She had decided, somewhere in the past 4 weeks, that steadiness in front of this man did not require the suppression of feeling. He was not a man who was made uncomfortable by genuine emotion. He simply gave it space, the way the prairie gives the sky space without competition. She moved to stand beside him and look at the window together. Their shoulders were almost touching. She felt the warmth of him in the cold air inside the unfinished house. "Walter," she said. "Yes." She turned to look at him, and he turned to look at her, and they were very close in the way that happens without planning when two people have been working side by side in a confined space for weeks, and their bodies have learned the geography of each other's proximity without their minds having formally acknowledged it. "I would very much like for you to stay," she said. "In Caldwell, near here." She paused, and then, because she was Theodora Kendrick and she had decided there was no longer any use in being imprecise about things that mattered, she added, "Near me." His eyes were dark and steady. He did not look away from her. "I had not planned on leaving," he said. "I know," she said. "But I wanted to say it." She held his gaze. "I have been without someone to say it to for 2 years. I find I would like to say things to you, specifically." There was his face doing the thing it sometimes did, the thing that she had come to watch for, the very slight movement at the corner of his mouth that in anyone else would be a smile but in Walter Walker was something more reserved and genuine for its restraint. And then he did something she had not seen him do before, which was that he lifted his hand and put it very carefully against her jaw, just the palm, warm against her cold cheek, and she let herself lean into it the smallest amount. "We should get the children," he said quietly. "Agnes will have supper on." "Yes," she said. He lowered his hand. They stood there another moment in the light of the south side kitchen window, and then Theodora picked up her coat from the floor where she had left it and put it on, and Walter picked up his hat and settled it on his head, and they walked out of the new house together into the cold early winter air. The winter that followed was a hard one for Caldwell and the surrounding area, as Kansas winters were in those years, with the kind of cold that came down from the north like a wall and stayed for months. And the snow that fell in January was the most serious in a decade, drifting against fences and houses, and changing the landscape into something silent and white and implacable. Theodora and the children had moved into the house in late November, before the worst of it came, and while the house was not yet finished in all its details, it was warm and solid and hers, and that was enough. Walter continued to come every day. In the first weeks of winter, when the outside work was impossible, he came in the evenings after his work at Fletcher's livery was done, and he did the interior finishing work, the shelving and the door frames and the small repairs that turn a structure into a home. Samuel was always nearby when he came, offering unsolicited opinions on where things should go and sometimes being correct, which Walter acknowledged without excessive praise, simply by incorporating the suggestion, which Theodora noticed was exactly the right thing to do with a 7-year-old who was still finding the shape of himself. Clara was warier. Theodora watched this without interference, because Clara had her father's instincts about people and her mother's caution about new things, and Theodora respected both. Walter did not push. He was present and consistent, and he spoke to Clara as he spoke to everyone, simply and directly, and without the condescension that many adults used with small children, and he did not try to make her like him, which was perhaps the very reason she eventually did. The moment Theodora noticed it happened on a cold December evening. Clara had been sitting at the new kitchen table with her small collection of river stones that she had been carrying everywhere since the fire, the one thing she had had in her pocket the night they had escaped. She had them arranged in some private order on the table, and Walter had come in and sat across from her and looked at the stones and said, quietly, "What do you call that one?" pointing to a smooth gray oval one that Clara particularly favored. And Clara had looked at him with her careful brown eyes and said, "That one is James." And Theodora, who was standing at the stove, felt her throat close entirely. Walter had looked at the stone and then at Clara, and he had said, "That is a good stone for that name." And Clara had nodded and gone back to her arrangement, and that was all. But something had crossed between them that Theodora knew was real and permanent. The name James had been used, for the first time in months, not as something to be carefully avoided but as something that simply existed in the room among them, and it had not broken anything. It had sat there quietly, the way real things do when they are finally allowed to be present. She told Walter that night after the children were asleep, when they were sitting by the stove with cups of coffee that had been hot when they had poured them and were now merely warm. "Thank you for what you did with Clara," she said. "With the stone." He looked at his cup. "She needed to say it," he said. "I just happened to be the one who asked." "You knew to ask." He was quiet for a moment. "I know something about keeping the name of someone you've lost alive," he said. "And something about how much it costs when there's no one who will say it with you." This was the most directly he had ever spoken about the thing she had been carefully not asking about for weeks. She weighted her hands around her cup. "My brother," he said after a while, "younger than me by 3 years. We were on a mining crew in Leadville together, an accident at the shaft in 1871. He stopped, started again. His name was Robert," she said. "Robert." He looked up at her. "Robert," she said again, simply, giving it back to him the way he had given James back to Clara. Something moved through his face, quiet and deep, like water moving under ice, not breaking it but visible through it. He put his coffee cup down on the floor and he put his face in his hands for a moment, not weeping, just holding it, and she let him, because that is what you do when someone has been carrying something a long time and finally sets it down briefly in a safe place. After a while he raised his head and looked at the stove. "After that I left Colorado," he said. "I know," she said. "I understand." He looked at her. "I think you do," he said, and there was in it something that might have been wonder. They sat together in the warm kitchen with the snow making its quiet sound against the windows and the stove ticking and the sleeping children somewhere beyond the wall, and the names of the dead sitting quietly with them, James and Robert, present and acknowledged and not diminished by being spoken. Later, when she thought about the winter, that evening would be one of the things she remembered most clearly. Not as a dramatic moment, but as the moment when the thing between them became something she did not have words for except real. December moved through its cold days and came to Christmas, which was a more cheerful affair than Theodora had expected. Agnes Dodd organized a gathering at the church hall that involved food enough for a small army and music from a fiddle player named Carpenter, who was technically a traveling man, but who had been technically traveling through Caldwell for about 6 months and showed no signs of continuing his journey. Theodora went with the children and Walter walked with them from the house to the church hall in the cold dark, and Samuel walked between them and held both their hands without ceremony, as if it were a thing that had always been arranged that way, and Theodora felt Walter's glance across the top of Samuel's wool hat, a small, private, warm look that was its own kind of declaration. The gathering was loud and warm and full of the generous ordinary life of a frontier settlement that had decided to make the most of the dark season. Reverend Platt gave a shorter speech than usual, which everyone appreciated. The fiddle music was good enough to dance to, and several couples took advantage of this in the cleared middle of the hall. Theodora watched and was content to watch, but toward the end of the evening Walter appeared beside her with an expression that suggested he was about to do something that did not come naturally to him and had been preceded by a private internal debate. "I am not a natural dancer," he said. "Neither am I," she said. "Then we'll be equally bad at it together," he said, and he held out his hand. She took it, and they went to the cleared space and danced, badly and happily, to a slow tune that the fiddle player called a waltz with only partial accuracy. And the hall was warm and smelled of pine and candle wax and roast meat. And the children were somewhere nearby with Agnes Dodd. And Theodora was aware of nothing very much except the warm solidity of Walter's hand in hers, and the slightly concentrated look on his face as he counted the steps in his head, which she found so genuinely endearing that she had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from grinning openly. "You're laughing at me," he said. "I am not," she said. "Your face is doing something," he said. "My face is dancing," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. And then he did something she had not seen him do before in all the weeks she had known him, which was that he laughed. A real laugh, not the ghost of a smile or the implication of one, but an actual sound, low and warm and full of something like relief, as if laughter were a thing he had been conserving for the right moment and had finally decided this was it. She loved him. She realized it right then, in the badly danced waltz in the church hall on Christmas evening, watching Walter Walker laugh at himself for the first time, and the realization arrived with a completeness that left no room for doubt or qualification. It was not the dizzy, catastrophic love of youth. It was something steadier and deeper and more considered, built from 4 weeks of hard shared work and cold evenings, and the exchanged names of the dead, and the sight of him crouching to the level of her 7-year-old son, and treating him like a person, and the feel of his palm against her cold cheek that one afternoon in the unfinished kitchen, with the south side window pouring light across the floor. She did not say it that night. She was not someone who said things before she was sure of them, and she was sure of this, but she wanted to give it a little more space before she put words to it, because some things are too important to be said in the middle of a badly danced waltz. January and February were the hardest months. The cold settled in like an occupation, and there were several weeks when travel outside the settlement was genuinely inadvisable, and several days when even the walk from the house to the water trough required real preparation. Walter managed to get to the livery every day because the animals there depended on him, and he was not the sort of man who let that consideration yield to comfort. But there were evenings when the weather kept him away from the Kendrick house and Theodora, and the children managed the evening alone, which was fine, but which left a particular quality of absence in the kitchen that Theodora noted and did not comment on even to herself. One evening in the deep of February, a man arrived at Caldwell from the south, half frozen and riding a horse that was on its last legs, with a story about a collapsed homestead 20 miles out and a family stranded. Walter and 2 of the Marsh brothers and the sheriff's deputy from town, a solid man named Marcus Holt who Theodora had always respected, went out the next morning to see what could be done. They were gone for 3 days. The family was found and brought in, 4 of them, a couple and 2 young sons, who had had their own version of catastrophe and who Agnes Dodd housed, and the town rallied around in the way that frontier settlements sometimes did, remembering that survival was a collective project. When Walter came back, he was very cold and somewhat thinner, and he smelled of smoke from makeshift camps and horse and 3 days without bathing, and he appeared at Theodora's door in the early morning before she had put the children up, and she opened the door and looked at him, and without any prior planning, she put her arms around him and held on. He was still for a moment because she had never done this and it was the first time their bodies had been in full contact, and she was aware of the surprise of it in him, the momentary stiffness, and then he put his arms around her in return, and she felt the weight of him come to rest against her, the exhaustion of 3 days of hard winter travel in it, and she held him and said nothing for a long moment. "The family is all right," she said against his shoulder. "They're all right," he said. "They'll be at Agnes's until spring." Good. She did not let go immediately, neither did he. When they finally separated, she saw in his face a clarity that had not quite been there before, as if something that had been slightly out of focus had resolved itself. She thought she probably had the same thing in her own face. "Come in," she said. "There is coffee and there is hot water for washing, and then I would like you to sit down and eat something." "Yes," he said, and came in, and she closed the door on the cold. March came slowly and then all at once, the way Kansas spring always did, as if the winter had been holding a door shut and then stepped back abruptly and let everything through at once. The snow retreated, and the ground thawed, and the mud season arrived, which was less pleasant than either winter or spring, but was at least a sign of transition. The prairie began its slow greening, the particular impossible green of the Kansas grassland coming back to life, and the cattle drives would begin coming through again before long, which would bring noise and commerce and occasional trouble to Caldwell. In early March, on a Sunday afternoon when the children were at Agnes Dodd's, and the light was the golden liquid light of early spring in the late afternoon, Walter walked with Theodora out along the creek that ran behind her property, the small silver-cold creek that had been frozen all winter and was now running clear and fast with the melt. They walked without talking for a while, which was comfortable between them in all the ways that comfortable silence is only possible when two people know each other well enough to share it without anxiety. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him and looked at whatever he was looking at, which turned out to be nothing in particular, just the creek running over its stones and the cottonwood trees just beginning to show the suggestion of green at their tips. "I have something to say," he said. "All right," she said. He turned to face her. He was wearing his canvas jacket and his battered hat, and he looked exactly like himself, which was, she had come to understand, one of the things she most valued about him, that he never looked like anything other than exactly what he was. "I know that you are not looking for someone to take care of you," he said. "I know that you can build a house and raise 2 children and manage a farm and come through a disaster with more grace and practical sense than anyone I have ever known." He paused. "I'm not offering to take care of you." "I know," she said. "I'm offering," he said carefully, as if he had prepared this and wanted to be precise, "to work beside you, for as long as you'll have me, at whatever that means and whatever it becomes." He stopped. "I love you, Theodora. I think I have since the morning I walked through that fence and found you still standing in the ash." Another pause. "I am not graceful about saying it, but it is true." She looked at him for a long moment, at the steady dark eyes and the jaw and the capable hands and the man who had handed her a shovel instead of a condolence, and who had said Robert when she gave him space to, and who had laughed in the church hall and who had put his arms around her when she had put hers around him without making it into more or less than what it was. "I love you, Walter," she said. It was simple. It was complete. It required nothing added to it. He moved to her and kissed her, there beside the creek in the March afternoon, with the cottonwoods just beginning to come back to life around them. And it was not a dramatic or theatrical kiss, but it was the kiss of two people who have been honest with each other for a long time and have arrived at this as a natural consequence of that honesty. And it was warm and sure and full of something that tasted like a future. When they separated, she was smiling, and he was doing the thing with the corner of his mouth that she had long ago started thinking of as his smile, the real one, the one he kept for things that actually warranted it. "The northeast corner still needs the mortar touch-up," she said. He laughed again, the real laugh. "In spring," he said. "In spring," she agreed. They walked back along the creek in the afternoon light, and when they came in sight of the house, Theodora saw it as she sometimes tried to see it, as an outsider might, a solid new house on the Kansas plain with the creek behind it, and the prairie spreading in all directions under a blue March sky. And it looked like exactly what it was, something that had come up out of ash and hard work and honesty, and that was exactly the right foundation for the things she intended to build next. April brought the spring in earnest, and with the spring came the cattle drives rolling up from Texas through the Kishom Trail, which passed east of Caldwell and drew commerce and rough men, and the particular energy of a town that knew itself to be at the edge of something wild. Theodora had seen the drives come through every spring since she and James had arrived in Kansas, and she had always maintained a practical relationship with them, selling eggs and butter, and sometimes fresh vegetables to the outfitters who provisioned the drovers. This spring she had more to offer, since the new house had a proper cold storage now, and she had rebuilt her kitchen garden from seed stock that Agnes Dodd had shared over the winter. Walter, who had spent part of his early years working cattle before he had moved to mining and construction, was known by some of the trail bosses who came through, the particular small world recognition of men who have moved through the same regions at different times. He introduced Theodora to the head outfitter for the largest of the spring drives, a weathered Texan named Caldwell, who had the air of someone who had seen every possible variation of landscape and human behavior, and was no longer surprised by any of it. The arrangement she made with Caldwell for the spring resupply put nearly $40 in her hand at the end of the first week of May, which was more than she had made in any single transaction since James's death. She brought the $40 home and spread it on the kitchen table and looked at it. "The orchard," she said. Walter was mending a bridle at the table. He looked at the money and then at her. "That's what you're thinking about." "I've been thinking about it since before the fire," she said. "Apple trees do well in this part of Kansas if you choose the right variety. It takes 5 years to get a real yield, but after that it's the most stable thing you can put in the ground." She looked at him. "I found out there's a nursery in Wichita that has rootstock. I wrote to them in February." He looked at her with that steady recognition that she had come to understand meant he was seeing her clearly and was not going to get in the way of what he was seeing. "How many trees?" "I think I can afford 20 rootstocks now," she said. "If I can get another 20 in the fall, the east section will be planted properly by spring of next year. The east section slopes well for drainage," he said, "and it gets afternoon sun." "I know," she said. "I planned it for the east section." He nodded slowly. "When are you riding back to the nursery in Wichita?" "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Tell them we'll need rootstocks rated for Zone 4 winters," he said. "Some of what they sell from Wichita is bred for further south." She looked at him. He had managed an orchard somewhere. She could tell by how specifically he had said that, the way specific knowledge always sounds different from general interest. "Where did you manage an orchard?" she asked. "My grandmother's place in Missouri," he said, going back to the bridle. "When I was a boy, before my father lost the farm, a beet. They were the best apple trees I ever knew, early harvests and winesaps, both rated for cold winters." "I'll tell them early harvests and winesaps," she said. He nodded, and then, without looking up from the bridle, "Theodora." "Yes. Will you marry me?" She had been expecting it and not expecting it at the same time, which is the way these things usually arrive. She sat across the table from him, and he was still looking at the bridle, because he was Walter Walker, and he had said the most important thing he was going to say with the same level attention he gave to everything, without theatrics, without any staging other than the practical evening moment at the kitchen table. And she found this so perfectly right that she felt tears arrive at the back of her eyes, which she did not try to prevent. "Yes," she said. He looked up then. His eyes were warm in the lamp light. "Good," he said. She laughed. "Good," she said. He put the bridle down and reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat there at the kitchen table with the $40 between them and the lamp burning, and the spring night beyond the south side kitchen window. And it was as close to perfect as Theodora Kendrick had ever felt. They married in June, in the small church in Caldwell, in a ceremony that Reverend Platt conducted with more feeling than usual, perhaps because even he had noticed that the thing between these two people was not the ordinary kind of frontier marriage of convenience, but something that had been built carefully and honestly out of difficult material, and was therefore worth more than the ordinary ceremony he was used to performing. Agnes Dodd cried, which was the most emotion anyone in the settlement had ever seen from her, and which made everyone else at least misty. The Marsh brothers attended and brought a wedding gift of 2 laying hens. The fiddle player carpenter provided music that was, on this occasion, actually a waltz, and Theodora and Walter danced it together and were, by the combined assessment of everyone present, not a bit better at it than they had been at Christmas, and this made everyone laugh, including them. Samuel wore his good shirt and a look of solemn approval. Clara wore a dress that Agnes Dodd had helped Theodora make from a bolt of blue cotton, and she spent most of the reception sitting with the stone she called James in her small fist. And once, when she thought no one was watching, she showed it to Walter with great seriousness, and Walter crouched to her level and looked at it with equal seriousness and said, "That is a fine stone, Clara," and she pressed her mouth together in a way that was not quite a smile but was its closest ancestor. After the ceremony, they rode back to the house together in the wagon, with the children asleep almost immediately in the back on a pile of blankets, worn out from the excitement, and the June evening settling warm and gold over the Kansas plain, and Theodora sat beside her husband on the wagon seat and leaned against him, and felt the particular luxury of a long project that has arrived at its completion, and found that the completed thing is everything you wanted it to be. "Walter," she said. "Yes." "The northeast corner mortar." He made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. The summer was full. Walter moved from the livery stable to full work on the Kendrick farm, which had been his intention since March, but which had required some negotiation with Fletcher, who was sorry to lose him but not surprised, because Fletcher was an observant man who had seen the direction of things. Walter's knowledge of construction and his practical skills applied themselves naturally to the expansion of the farm's infrastructure, and by August there was a new chicken house and a hay barn, and the beginnings of the tack room he was building adjacent to the small stable where Theodora's horse and the mule lived. She had sold enough eggs and butter and early garden vegetables to the cattle trade that season to afford a second milk cow, which she named Patience, in distinction from Bess, who was decidedly not patient. In September, she wrote to the nursery in Wichita and ordered the second 20 rootstocks, and when they arrived in October, she and Walter planted them in the east section together, in rows measured with string and settled into holes dug, with the same 2 long-handled shovels that he had brought to the ruins of her first house on the morning after the fire. She paused when she realized this, standing in the orchard that did not yet look like an orchard, with the October sky above her and the first 20 rootstocks already in the ground from the spring planting, and the second 20 going in now. "These are the same shovels," she said. Walter stopped digging, looked at her. "Yes," he said. She thought about this. The morning after the fire. Standing in the ash with the smoke still curling and the half-burned structure behind her and the world entirely reconfigured from what it had been the day before, and this man walking through the fence with these 2 shovels and saying, "Where do we start?" "I never thanked you for that," she said. "Properly?" He was quiet for a moment. "You thank me by taking the shovel," he said. She looked at him. "That is either very simple or very profound," she said. "Both," he said, and went back to digging, and she smiled at the ground and went back to digging too. The fall was harvest and preparation and the good kind of busy that ends with a full root cellar and a sense of provision made and winter not feared. Theodora found herself looking at the new house with a settled appreciation that was different from the first relief of having it finished, something slower and deeper, the appreciation of someone who understands the full cost of what they are inhabiting and is not taking any of it for granted. She was also, by October, quietly certain that she was expecting a child. She told Walter on a Tuesday evening, standing in the kitchen, because there was no particular moment that seemed more right than another, and she had learned that the right moment was usually the one you were in. He had been hanging the last of the autumn herbs to dry from the ceiling beam, and he stopped and looked at her with a stillness that she knew by now was not blankness but the opposite, was the fullest possible attention. Then he said, "Are you well?" "Entirely," she said. "Everything seems to be as it should be." He got down from the step stool he had been standing on slowly, and he came to her and put his hands on her face, both of them, the way he had put one hand that first time in the unfinished kitchen in November, and he looked at her for a long, full moment with something in his eyes that she had no word for that fit, something that was too large for a single emotion and was probably several of them at once. "Good," he said. "Good," she said. He kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and then stood with his arms around her in the kitchen that had the south side window and the right side light, and they stood there for a while with the autumn evening coming in through the glass and the herbs drying above them, smelling of sage and thyme and lavender, and the children were somewhere in the house making the particular sounds of two children occupied with their own world, and it was all, Theodora thought, with the calm certainty of a woman who had rebuilt from ash and knew the value of what she had built, exactly right. The winter of 1874 into 1875 was milder than the previous one, which was a mercy. The children were growing visibly, Samuel increasingly interested in the practical workings of the farm, and spending long hours with Walter learning to care for the horses and the livestock with the same kind of focused attention he had first shown sorting scrap lumber. Clara had started school in the fall, at the small schoolhouse on the north end of Caldwell run by a patient young woman named Miss Fletcher, no relation to the livery man, who had come out from Ohio and seemed determined to stay. Clara took to reading with an avidity that Theodora recognized as her own, and came home from school almost every day with a new word to deploy at dinner. She had also, over the fall, adopted Walter as the person she chose to ask when she had a question about something that adults were supposed to know. This was not stated or formalized, but Theodora observed it with a quiet joy that she considered one of the private luxuries of her life. Clara would say, "Walter, why does the ice on the creek freeze from the edges in and not from the middle out?" And Walter would sit down and think about it for a moment, and then explain it in a way that was clear and honest, and that did not talk down to her. And Clara would nod with the satisfied air of someone who has received exactly the answer they needed, and go back to whatever she was doing. Samuel, at 8, had decided that he wanted to be a builder when he grew up, which meant he had been building things out of scrap lumber in the corner of the hay barn all winter, small, ambitious structures that Walter inspected regularly with genuine attention, and always found something specific to note, both what was working and what could be improved, in the way of a teacher who respects their student. In early spring of 1875, the orchard began to show its first real signs of life. The roots had taken, and the trees that had gone in the previous spring were leafing out with a confidence that said they intended to stay. Theodora walked among them in the March mud with her considerably increased middle and felt the satisfaction of patience beginning to pay off. 5 years until a real yield, she had said the previous year. 4 years now, 3 the year after. The orchard had its own timeline and was keeping to it. The child arrived in April, a boy. He was born at the Kendrick house with the help of Dr. Avery, who had been called from Caldwell at dawn, and Agnes Dodd, who had been called the night before as a matter of prudence, and had stayed without being asked. Walter was present for the entirety of it, because Theodora had been very clear that she wanted him there, and because it had never occurred to him that he might not be. He was a man who did not flinch from difficult things, and he sat beside her and held her hand with the same steady presence he brought to everything. And when the boy arrived, and the room changed quality in the way rooms do when a new life enters them, Theodora saw on Walter's face the same uncontainable thing that had been there when she told him she was expecting, that thing for which she still had no single adequate word. "Robert," she said when the boy was in her arms and the first fierce relief of it was settling into the warm days of aftermath. Walter went very still. She looked at him over the boy's head. "If you'll allow it," she said, "Robert James Walker." He could not speak for a moment. She watched him find the steadiness he needed and understood what it cost him and loved him for it. "Yes," he said finally. His voice was not entirely even, but it did not need to be. "Yes, both names." "Both names," she said. "They should be remembered." Agnes Dodd, who had been doing something practical in the corner, turned around to find something to look at through the window, which was the most private moment she was going to give them, and which was Agnes Dodd's particular form of grace. Robert James Walker was a solid, peaceful child who announced his presence loudly when hungry and was otherwise serene, which Clara pronounced highly satisfactory, and Samuel found slightly less interesting than the mechanical workings of the new hay rake, but worthy of regular inspection. He had his mother's eyes and his father's quietness, which meant he studied the world around him with a thoughtful attention that delighted Theodora, who had always believed that what the world needed more than anything was careful observers. The summer of 1875 was good. The orchard trees were growing steadily. The farm was producing. The root cellar was full by August. The second milk cow Patience was living up to her name by giving excellent milk with no drama. Walter had built an additional room on the back of the house over the winter, which meant the children each had their own small space, and the house had achieved the shape that Theodora had been carrying in her mind since the morning after the fire. She sometimes sat on the porch in the evenings, when the work was done and Robert was asleep and Samuel and Clara were doing the last of their chores or their reading, and she looked out at the prairie and thought about the geography of how she had arrived at this particular point on it. The fire that had taken everything. The morning after, standing in the ash. The moment when every man in the settlement had offered her something that looked like help and felt like being seen as a problem to be managed. And then this one man who had walked through the fence with 2 shovels and 4 words and had seen her instead, as someone who was already standing and just needed to know which direction. Walter came and sat beside her on the porch on one of those evenings. Robert was asleep on his shoulder, which happened often, since Robert seemed to find Walter's particular stillness the optimal condition for sleep. Walter sat in the other porch chair and looked out at the prairie with the baby and the last light. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About where we started," she said. He nodded. He knew what she meant, and what she meant was more than the location. "I have been thinking," she said, "that I would like to expand the vegetable selling operation next summer. There is a hotel opening in Wichita, and they are looking for reliable suppliers." She had been writing letters again. She was always writing letters. Fresh produce to a hotel kitchen is more reliable income than the cattle drive trade. "The soil on the south quarter is better for the larger-scale vegetable growing," he said. "We'd need to break new ground in spring." "I know," she said. "I want to start in March." "March it is," he said. Robert made a small, contented sound in his sleep, and Walter adjusted him automatically, with the ease of someone who has learned to carry a sleeping child without disturbing them, and Theodora looked at the two of them in the evening light and felt the full warm weight of everything she had. "Walter," she said. "Yes." "Thank you for that morning," she said. "For the shovel, for the question." He was quiet for a moment. The prairie held its evening light. A nighthawk called somewhere above the orchard. "You would have started with or without me," he said. "Yes," she said, "but I would have started alone." He turned to look at her. In the low light his eyes were warm and quiet and entirely present, the way they always were when he looked at her, with the fullness of his attention, all of it, without reservation. "So would I," he said, "for the rest of my life, until the morning I walked through that fence." She reached across the space between the 2 chairs and put her hand in his, and he held it in the sure, careful way he held everything he intended to keep. And they sat on the porch of the house they had built from ash, with the orchard beginning to take its permanent shape in the east section, and the baby sleeping on his father's shoulder, and the children's voices somewhere inside, and the Kansas prairie rolling away from them in all directions in the last gold of the day. And it was. By every measure Theodora had learned to apply to such things, exactly right. The years that followed had the quality of good years, the kind that are full enough that they pass quickly but leave deep marks. The orchard came into its first real bearing in 1878, 5 years almost to the day from the morning Theodora had stood in the ash. And the early harvests were exactly what Walter had promised, the best variety for a Kansas winter, coming in heavy and sweet in September with the winesaps close behind in October. The hotel in Wichita had been a good arrangement, and by 1877 Theodora had expanded it to 2 hotels and a restaurant. Hauling produced north twice a week in the warm season in the farm wagon with Samuel, now 11 and capable, riding alongside. She bought 3 additional acres to the east in 1876, extending the orchard section, and Walter planted a windbreak of cottonwoods along the north property line that everyone said would take too long and would not be established before the next serious prairie fire season, and which were growing, by 1878, with the robust health of trees that knew they had been put in the right place. The northeast corner mortar was repaired in the spring of 1875, as promised, and held perfectly thereafter, as Walter had also promised. Clara, at 9, was reading everything she could find and had declared her intention to be a schoolteacher, which Miss Fletcher at the Caldwell School encouraged with specific attention, and which Theodora supported with a quiet pride that Clara could not yet fully appreciate because she was 9, and the future was still theoretical. Samuel, at 11, was building things of increasing complexity in the hay barn, and had begun to help Walter with actual construction work on neighboring properties, for which they were paid in modest amounts of cash, or in the labor exchange common to frontier communities. Robert James Walker grew into a child of serene competence who could walk the full fence line of the property at age 2 without assistance, and who by 3 had a working relationship with both dogs and every cat that chose to visit the barn, which suggested a temperament that was going to be useful in the world. The second child they had together came in 1877, a girl this time, born in the same April week as Robert had been, as if she was making a point about the calendar. They named her Margaret, which had been Walter's mother's name, a fact he had never mentioned until Theodora asked him what names he had been thinking about, and the particular way he said the name told her what it meant to him, and she said Margaret without hesitation and watched his face do the thing that always moved something deep in her. Margaret was very different from Robert, very different from either of the other children, loud and opinionated and physically bold from her first months, pulling herself to standing at 8 months, and surveying the available world with a proprietary satisfaction that made Theodora laugh out loud the first time she saw it. Walter watched Margaret with a kind of awed attention that suggested he was already slightly outpaced by her, and was genuinely interested to see what she was going to do next. By the spring of 1879, 6 years from the morning of the fire, the Kendrick Walker farm was one of the most productive small operations in the county. The apple harvest was a genuine regional enterprise. The produce supply to Wichita was established and reliable. The house was solid and well-maintained and full. Walter had been approached twice by other settlers needing construction help, and had taken on small contracts in the winters when farm work was slow, which added to their stability in the cold months. They were not wealthy, but they were what mattered more than wealthy in that time and place, which was secure, with resources enough to weather a bad season and enough of a margin that a single catastrophe would not undo everything. Theodora wrote to her sister in Tennessee, with whom she had maintained a correspondence across the years, and described it all in a letter that ran to 8 pages, which was the longest letter she had ever written, and which ended with the sentence that she believed, as happy as it is possible for a person who understands the real cost of things to be, which her sister wrote back to say was the most Theodora thing she had ever read, which was true, and they both knew it. The morning of the anniversary of the fire, in October of 1879, Theodora walked out to the orchard before the rest of the house was awake. The winesap trees were finishing their harvest, the last of the fruit dark red in the early October sun, and the early harvests had already been brought in and stored in the cold cellar and promised to Wichita. She stood in the middle of the orchard and looked at the trees, at what had been rootstocks in this ground 6 years ago, and were now full-bearing trees with real bark and real branches, and the permanent look of things that have decided to stay exactly where they are. She thought about the morning of the fire with the clarity that comes from enough time having passed that you can look directly at a difficult thing without flinching. The ash, the cold. Samuel gripping her hand with both of his. Clara on the fence post. The townsfolk with their sympathy and their performance of grief. And then a man and 2 shovels and 4 words. She heard footsteps behind her and knew them before she turned. Walter moved through the orchard the way he moved everywhere, without hurry, with that particular quality of intention in every step that she had first noticed the morning. He had walked through the burned fence and come directly to her through the crowd of sympathetic people. He came to stand beside her and looked at the trees. 6 years, she said. Yes, he said. I have been thinking, she said, about the question you asked me that morning. He waited. Where do we start, she said. That was the whole thing, that question. It assumed that we were going to start. That starting was not in question, only the location. He looked at her sideways, that quiet, warm look she had memorized across thousands of mornings and evenings. It was the only sensible question, he said. It was the kindest thing anyone has ever said to me, she said. And it was not kind in any of the usual ways. He thought about this. It was just true, he said. You were going to start. The only real question was where. She turned to face him in the orchard, with the winesap trees around them and the October sky above, and the grass green and gold in the morning light. She looked at him, at this man who had walked into her catastrophe with a shovel and a practical question, and who had stayed and built and planted and laughed, and said the name of his dead brother, and danced badly in the church hall, and held her hand through childbirth, and sat with her on the porch in the evenings watching the prairie, and who had given her, when she had not known she needed it, the experience of being seen clearly and treated as capable, which was the most complete form of love she understood. Thank you, she said, for starting with me. He put his hand against her face, the way he had that first time in the unfinished kitchen, steady and warm. Thank you, he said, for taking the shovel. She put her hand over his. They stood in the orchard in the October morning, as the house behind them began to make its waking sounds, the particular sounds of 4 children at various stages of mourning, and the dogs and the livestock, and all the ordinary irreplaceable music of a life that has been built carefully and honestly from good materials, including one morning's catastrophe and 2 long-handled shovels and the question of where to start. And the answer, as it had always been, was here. Right here, wherever here happened to be together, with their hands on the work and their eyes on what came next, and the full weight of everything they had built between them and behind them, solid and real and theirs. The orchard would yield another good harvest next year. The windbreak cottonwoods were tall enough now to do their job. Margaret was already trying to climb the lowest apple tree branches, which meant someone needed to go inside and monitor that situation before it became a morning's crisis. And Walter was already turning toward the house with the particular alert attention of a father who has assessed the sound of a small girl's silence and found it suspicious. Go, Theodora said, smiling. He went, walking quickly through the trees toward the house, and she heard him call Margaret's name in that quiet, level way that meant he had spotted the problem and was handling it, and she heard Margaret's indignant response, which suggested that the problem was, as predicted, tree-related. Theodora stood in the orchard a moment longer, alone in the morning light, and breathed the apple-cool air and looked at what she had grown from the ash of what she had lost. And she felt, with the full grounded certainty of a woman who has rebuilt her world from the ground up and knows the value of every board and stone and root and year of it, entirely and completely at home. Then she turned and walked back toward the house where her family was, and started the day.